Now it's time to, as you'll see in the program that we've put together, it's interesting that, we think of a dialogue as being very open and free-flowing, which it is, but it's also fairly structured because we want to make sure that we both have good theory and good stories, and I do feel that we're in very good shape in both those regards. So tonight we have 4 what we're calling featured speakers who will help us really make concrete some of these the challenges and the opportunities and the ways in which diasporic driven peace building and conflict transformation initiatives are actually unfolding, so we can really make it specific. But we've also decided that it would be really important to begin with a poetic opening, and we've invited the wonderful poet and scholar Juliane Okot Bitek. If I haven't mispronounced, I hope not. So we're very happy to have Julie here with us tonight. She comes, as she says in her bio, quite honestly to her diasporic identity. She was born in Uganda, born to Ugandan exiles in Kenya. She has a bachelor's degree in fine arts and a master's in English, and this fall she begins her doctorate as a Liu Scholar at UBC, and she lives here in Vancouver, and we're very happy to have her tonight. Thanks, Julie.
Hi, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Before I start, I want to say thank you to Shaheen and Joanna for inviting me for this, and also to, can you hear me? No, not quite? All right, I'll speak up. I also want to thank SFU and the WASC Center for having such an awesome gig. All right. I want to first take a breath because there was good advice to take a breath before I start, and read you an excerpt from a book I've been writing called The Dry Season. And The Dry Season is based on the experiences of some young women who were kidnapped by the Lord's Resistance Army, which is a guerrilla group that operated in Uganda from 1987 until about 2007, and now they're in the Congo or in Sudan or in Central African Republic. They're no longer in Uganda anyway. Between 1987 and 2007, 30,000 children were kidnapped in northern Uganda. Many of them never came back. I'm only going to write about 4 of them, and right now just read an excerpt from it. This is called The Things We Carried. Here's a map you will not find on any atlas. Here's a map of allegations, of mythological places, of instances that might have been, of lies, of intentions and truth set up together on slippery, muddy paths. Here's a map of prayers that went unanswered. Here's a map of questions, curiosity, a map of growing and dying, of trekking over the same terrain many times over. You'd think that places remain the same. Study the map. Look at it closely. Step back. Look again. Consider the images it evokes. We were there. When we left, the landscape closed itself off, and our presence that marked it had disappeared. Do you see any evidence of us? What does a map say about what we were when we were there? Does a map tell you who we are? I'll draw you a map because you ask, and because I need a complete accounting of where you went. We walked everywhere. We walked from Apach to Atiak, over the hilly outcrops at Kilak and Ator, passing through Anaha and Pabo, across the Achua River with its furious rapids in the wet season that boils over black rocks and steamy fog that seems to shroud the whole country. We passed through Padey, Kitgum, Palabek, Padibe, Namakora, and Labuo, mapping the breadth of northern Uganda round and round like a starved hornet over a bush. We traced the Nile to the unmanned border at Nimule. In Sudan, we walked through to Torit, Gong, Luwudu, Palutaha, settled for a while in Nichitu, Juba, Lala, and Rubatek before leaving for the Imatong Mountains. We crouched through forested areas, bountiful gardens, and open grasslands. Sometimes we made do with caves. Other times, we made fire by the riverbank for a single night, never two. It's easy to say that distances are nothing when you have stories and company and a light heart. It was a long way away, We had stories, but we had no light heart. We carried everything. We carried our own luggage on our heads. We carried our babies on our backs, snugly tied with a cloth. We carried the babies of women who could not carry their own children on our hips. And if we didn't have a baby to carry, we carried other things on our backs. We carried 2 basins each on top of whatever else we carried. We carried AK-47 slung over our shoulders with leather belts. We could never put the guns down. We carried food, millet, corn, pigeon peas, smoked meat, sesame seeds, beans, goats, sorghum, dura, dried meat, lentils, and canned fish. We carried sugar. We carried salt. We carried water. We carried luggage for our husbands and commanders. We carried our thoughts. We carried 20-liter debbies of oil. We carried soap and toothpaste and face cream that was looted along the way. We carried the thoughts of our families and the good times we'd known at home. We carried the weight of the sun as it bore down on our necks and faces. We carried what luck we left, because those who ran out of luck lost their lives. We carried the spirits of our forefathers and the prayers we'd learned at home. We carried the rosary in our heads so we could remember. We recited, Our Father, who art in heaven. We recited, Glory be. We recited, Hail Mary. We called the names of our family members in our heads so that we didn't forget that they'd ever lived. We believed our families were dead. Some of us knew our families were dead, or they would have come to rescue us. Some others of us knew that our families had to be dead because we'd seen them dead before we were taken. We prayed that the relatives we'd left didn't try to rescue us, or they'd be hurt. We carried pain in our hearts and in our shoulders, and we carried what remained of ourselves. We carried guilt. We carried the burden of having taken part in the hurting, for kicking the one boy until he was dead, for taking turns at stepping on another boy's head. We had to do it in the company of menacing faces and sharply bayoneted guns waving in our faces. We carried our hurt selves, our defiled selves, our stained selves, the selves that had been raped over and everywhere there was an opening. We carried the innocence that remained of our bodies. We carried luggage. We carried burdens and questions, no answers. We carried ulcers and chests that still burned like a fire inside. We carried gunshot wounds that sometimes healed into tiny scars and sometimes branded us like animals. We accepted the keloids that formed on our backs and forearms and massaged them gently when we had a chance. And we stopped wincing when we walked through the long, dark green elephant grass with arms and legs exposed to the sharp blades that sliced our skins at every turn. We carried hope in our hearts, sometimes very little, too little to stretch out for days, weeks, months, years, a decade and a half more. But we did. We carried the girls that we wore in the smallest part of our brains, the girls that still refused to come out and play with innocence. We carried them along anyway, and sometimes we laughed. We were the ting-ting, the young goose, the carriers, the young ones, the kuroots, the girls, the daughters of people who carried us in our hearts the whole time. They carried us in their hearts for nothing. We wouldn't exist anymore. We couldn't, not as they knew us, not as they had loved us, except perhaps for the selves in us that remained intact that no one else could see. We carried babies in our wombs and babies in our arms, and through the babies we carried our families and what we remembered of them. A nose here, a smile there, a forehead, fingers, a giggle that was familiar. We carried scars from beatings, scars from lashes, open sores from broken gumboots in the sand, which would grate at our feet as we traversed the borders, crossed streams, and fought the bows in the jungles. We carried hoes, we carried seeds, we sang. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. We carried everything to God in prayer. We couldn't deserve this, but then again, this was our home and we were meant to be here. How could we explain it otherwise? How could we have been chosen to be hit on the chest with the butt of a gun, to be stomped on with gumboots for minor reasons or any reasons at all? How could we explain it any other way except by accepting that we were chosen for this? Were we? No one came to get us. The white nun, Sister Rakele, she came to get her girls only, the girls from St. Mary's High School, just them, and at that, not all of them. The Pope prayed for the girls from St. Mary's. The media wrote about the girls from St. Mary's. The Holy quarreled about the girls from St. Mary's and guarded them jealously. The government of Uganda searched for the girls of St. Mary's, but not us. For sure, not us. No one came for us, nobody. We would never return. Not the same way, not the same people. We remained intact in the way we looked at each other, mirroring pain and occasional laughter. We carried ourselves from town to town, country to country, through mountain and grassland, across the Nile, Aswa, Kit, Agago, Unyama, Atebi, and many other streams. We walked through forest and desert and came home to nothing. So we waited. First, we waited for the nightmares to end. We waited for our fathers to stop committing suicide on account of us missing, or on account that we came back not the same as we'd left, not the same at all. We waited for the haunting, the chien to rise up like a mist and dissipate into the brilliant blue sky, because we couldn't fly away. We had no wings, so we had to stay. We waited for help. We got help in the form of letters, money, sewing classes, clothing, therapy, sometimes an empathetic touch on the shoulder without any discernible hesitation. We waited for the embrace of family and former friends, and sometimes we got it and sometimes we didn't. We waited for the voices to stop howling in the night. We waited for silence. We waited for peace. We waited for the children to grow. We watched them toddling, walking, going to school eventually, but not being able to shrug off that invisible layer. That's something that had been layered on them from over there. We tried to scrub off the chin, but it doesn't wash off. It requires ritual. It requires prayer and patience, and so we continued to wait. We waited for time to undo the paternities of the children, for them to stop asking who their fathers were, where they were, how come they did not visit, were they not loved. We waited for children to forget their early childhood experiences, the insistence that they sleep with their gumboots close by just in case they have to run away, to get away from the gunshots and the bombs in the middle of the night. We waited to forget it all. We did not ask for this. None of us did. Did our families imagine the things that happened to us? Could our mothers love us anymore after this? Could anybody? We couldn't even think of the complete rejection when we would face on returning home. Some of our mothers wouldn't look at us. They'd moved on. They'd remarried. They'd had other children. At first, we thought we saw love mingle with the relief in our fathers' eyes as tears ran down their faces. But over time, our fathers started to mutter under their breaths that they did not bring up daughters that way, to have children that way, to be wild like animals. Money for school fees from me, go get school fees from the men who fathered those children, our own fathers and our fathers' own words. So we waited for normal, and normal never showed. We missed going to school. We missed classes. We knew that our classmates had gone on with their education and that this was no education. We carried the knowledge that some people would become big people and sit in big offices and make big decisions, but not us. Ours was a different kind of schooling. Our schooling was the carrying of things and pictures in our heads, so we walked with those images whirring in our heads like bees lost. We took this image to the reception offices in Gulu and sat with it, waiting for treatment, waiting for reconciliation, repatriations, decisions, assistance, waiting for someone, anyone to accept us. We carried hopelessness. We carried grief, sadness, insults like tropical rain on tin roofs, spittle that flew from the mouths of the men as they shouted at us and threatened to burn down our houses, to kill us, they say, as their families had been killed by the rebels. Sometimes full spit was hawked from the back of the neck, from the back of the throat, and hurled at us. It was cold when it hit us, and slimy when we wiped it off. We knew all this when we waited with our lips stuck together, dry like our hands, gray like the dust on our feet, the only soft being the kanga that we used to carry the babies, soft and worn out. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening.